This is my introduction to the first week of assignments and for TE 899 TESOL. And what um, I'd like to give you an overview of English second language because too often it's seen as teaching English second language is kind of rather simple or easy. Unexciting job. I think it's as exciting as being James Bond or some kind of international traveler of some sort. And I want to put this within some context to you. Many years ago, teaching English as a second language was often done overseas. People said, "Oh, you're getting your degree in ESL, or that's nice. What are you going to do? You're going to be a missionary?" Well, a lot of them were. When I was first in graduate school, a lot of people getting their either their endorsement, their master's down in Oklahoma State University, were actually planning to be missionaries. Some were going to China. They're going other places. They knew that teaching English would be something useful, and people would let them in the country. Okay, so that was their plan. Now, I was always a straight ESL person. I thought it was interesting. I'll tell you how I got into it. I got into English as a second language by total chance. Okay. By the way, I'm Glenn Tracy. I think I was thinking deep in the conscious stream and then just skipped over some introductions. But I happened to be teaching at Kirksville, Missouri at the Truman State University. And I was teaching a small class in Spanish because they needed somebody to teach Spanish. I was not really a Spanish teacher, but I knew some. I had studied Spanish. I was a graduate assistant. And then they said, "Oh, rather than teach English to American students as a graduate assistant, why don't you teach English to our international students?" And because they didn't have an ESL program, it was at a college, and they said, "Well, almost all those students are from Iran." And if you know, Iran's in the news right now about the oil tankers, and Trump is upset, and maybe we're going to have a war over there, etc. Well, there was tension in 1979, 1978. And I was drafted into being an ESL teacher. Instead of teaching grammar to college freshmen, I was teaching writing to ESL students, totally unprepared. I was just teaching writing class, basically. But these students need reading and writing and speaking and listening, but no one was planning on that then. They just said, "No, just teach them to write an essay," which really is quite a task if someone's not very fluent. So I got thrown in, and all my students, except for one or two, were speakers of Persian. They were from Iran, and at that time, Iran was having a huge. They were overthrowing the old leader, the Shah of Iran, and I remember I had students that were communist, students that were Shiite Muslim, and then I had students that were more liberal democratic types. And they were all arguing about what the future is going to be. And I know a lot of them have died because they were on the wrong side of what the future was for that country. The future of the country was a religious theocracy. And a lot of the students I knew, some of them wanted to have votes and democracy, and others were strict communists. And I know the communists didn't survive. There's been a lot of war over there. So many people have died. So I'm sure sad thinking about what happened to those students when they went back to Iran. But for me as an ESL teacher, it was exciting because I ended up discovering so many things about Iran. And I love politics and I like international relations. So it was very interesting. Culture, food. I learned things about their culture, about male-female relationships, about the way people wrote. when they would write, they would actually write in a pattern similar to their own language. So it was very exciting for me. And in fact, a lot of English as second language historically, it really goes back to, you can actually talk about second language learning all the way back to the ancient Greeks. We know the Greeks were very important. Most people wanted to learn Greek back, 2,200 years ago or whatever. Greeks were the philosophers, the mathematicians, first great thinkers in terms of trying to create a central way of thinking about how the world is and how we should think about the world, where it wasn't just religion from ancient times to Babylonia or Egypt, but people were trying to come up with hard sciences. And gradually they did. We had Socrates, Plato, philosophy. But the second language was Greek. And then the Romans came along and they borrowed a lot, or they stole a lot of stuff, literally, Greek statues and architecture. And the Romans created their own world. And their language became very important. And people later wanted to learn Latin. So you could be an educated person in Europe or wherever, North Africa or Middle East, but it was important that you spoke Latin, the language of the Romans. And so people studied Latin, and that you'll still see there's a little of that still going on in some universities. But over time, different languages became important as the second language. There was your language, and then there was another language, and other languages came along, and people, to be educated, they said, oh, you must speak Greek, or you must know Latin. Used to be ministers, priests or ministers, Protestant or Catholic, whatever, that they had to know ancient Greek or how to read some parts of it, or they had to know Latin if they were going to be the Latin Mass in the Catholic Church. So a second language, totally different than the one that you speak in everyday life. They call that the vulgar language. It doesn't mean it's vulgar, but it means it's the language of the people. And so different languages became the second language. English didn't even exist then. But then later, with the rise of the Middle East and Islam, Arabic became a very important language. And many people, the Quran is written in Arabic, and many people, no matter what their language, they learn Arabic if they're Muslim. And so within that, now we're not talking China. China was the main language if you're in China. But I know about the Middle East, history in the Middle East and Europe. And so we had different important second languages. And then we got to the Middle Ages, and then eventually it became French and later German. So it used to be when I was many, many years ago, that if you were going to get your doctorate, that you had to pass a reading test, sometimes in both, or at least one, of German or French. This may sound bizarre to you, but it was required that you do study a little bit of French and German so that you could do a rough translation of a couple of paragraphs. And that wasn't very fluent, but that's what they called good enough. If you can show some competence in German and French, then okay, you can go ahead and finish your PhD in whatever subject it is. So it was interesting. There was always another language. Well, after we get to the 20th century, 19th century with the British, then English became important. And why did it become important? It was the language of the people that had control of much of the world. The British English was everywhere. It's in India and Australia, and parts of the places in British Guiana in South America. And a lot of people said, you got to know English. Before, you had to know German, or German was the language of science, and French was the language of literata. You're educated and you understand the arts, and you speak French. Oh my gosh, you spoke. And it was also the language of diplomacy. Well, nowadays it's English. So this has evolved over time. I'm giving you a really quick history. But English was not the original important language that everybody had to learn. Nowadays, people use English because you have Russians and Chinese and Japanese. Well, the Chinese are not going to learn Japanese, and the Russians are not going to learn French. But a lot of these different countries, they learned English because of the political power of and wealth of the British Empire in Europe, but also of the Americans. And so English was a very common language. It was the language that if you knew that one, you could talk to somebody from another place. So that's a history of why their second languages are so important. I have a history. When I was in Enid, Oklahoma, at one time, I had a group of men who were Hungarian come up to me, and they were working in an oil field. They were employed by a Greek company, but they had employed Hungarians who were experts on rigs for oil drilling. And the companies had purchased oil drilling rigs, the drills and all the equipment and stuff like that. But they weren't drilling for oil. They were getting all this equipment so they could drill for water in Syria. So you had all these different languages and countries involved, but it was important to know some English. So they actually paid me with wine. They would bring me Hungarian wine that they bought at a local liquor store. They didn't bring it from Hungary. In fact, I remember it said on there in English, the blood of the bull, but it wasn't blood. It was just wine. It was red wine. And they wanted me to teach them English. So we had a lot of fun. It was ironic because some of them spoke, they were Hungarians, and several of them, their names were Attila, Attila the Hun. And I started laughing. I said, "Is your name really Attila?" "Oh yeah, that's a very common name." And if you know your history, if you don't, Attila the Hun was a great barbarian that came from the eastern parts of Russia or something, and he settled in Hungary. And the name became very popular, kind of like John is or something in England, but it was Attila. And I said, "Well, what's your name?" "Attila." "What's your name?" "Attila." "What's your son's name?" "Oh, my son's Attila." Now they had other names, but it's kind of like saying you named your kid after some name that's to us is like Genghis Khan, Mongolia. "Oh, Genghis is here." I'd start laughing. I said, "You named this little kid after, Okay. So, but that was something I learned. Now, my own students over the years, I've had students here at UNK for 20 years. A lot of my students teach English in local public schools or Catholic schools or private schools. And they go and they teach kids from different countries. A lot of them work in meat packing plants over in Lexington's big and Grand Island and Omaha, Madison, Nebraska. But I've also had students come here and even in online classes that are living in China or they're living in Mexico or something. It's really cool. And so people are learning to teach English, but some are teaching English here in a place where English is all around, but the students themselves may be Hispanic or from Africa, there's Somali, or they may be from a place, they're called the Karen, who are people from Burma, who are driven out of Burma, or Myanmar, as it's called. I'm mentioning a lot of names. You can look here if you want. I'm writing down some of it, but I'm ad-libbing part of it. So you can teach internationally, or you can teach in the United States. So it's really very interesting endorsement. Now in the United States, in Nebraska, you have to be certified by the state. They require approximately 15 hours. Now we have 18 hours on our endorsement. I can share more information if you want to know more about that. But the world is coming into the United States. Now we have all this tension over immigration. And so you know about that. The wall, build the wall, don't build the wall, arrest people, very ugly, ugly thing. But a lot of the students that come, just because they don't speak English doesn't mean they're They could be not educated at all, and some of them could be college level, very well educated people. All they have in common is they just don't speak English. Most of the world, a lot of the world doesn't speak English. Okay. You can speak English and be very poor and live in the United States, but you can be very poor, come to the United States and not speak English. Doesn't mean they're not good in math. So you can't assume anything. You have to find out about your students. I always want to tell them that. Now we get a lot of kids from war. I had somebody the other day tell me how they have a student whose parents had been murdered, and they had watched them be murdered. And they were from, I won't go in detail, but they were from, I've had this occurred many times. I've had people from Liberia and Western Africa who told me they saw their brother murdered in front of them because he did not give food to some of the people that had guns. They said, I can't give you this food because it's for my family. And they said, oh, you won't give us the food? And they shot and killed their brother. So you're dealing, when you do with ESL, you deal with all kinds of conditions. Some are the most, like a doctor's son coming to your school that may not speak English, and maybe a nurse, and they're from the Philippines, and their kid's going to learn English. Or you may have somebody coming in who has no family, who's basically has just the clothes on their back, and they may be legal, documented, or they may not have documentation. I never use the word illegal, so I just say documented, undocumented. If they're Hispanic, I say con documentos or sin papeles, without papers. Okay, so the world of English as a second language is wide open. And that's why I find it exciting, because you may go and teach kindergarten and teach ESL in Gibbon, Nebraska, or you may go over and be in southeastern China as a missionary, or just as a person traveling, maybe, and you're teaching English, and you may have other things you're doing. You may be saying, I'm trying to convert people, I want them to become Christians. So I've had people learn English so they could go on to college and teach somewhere, maybe get a PhD. And I want to emphasize again, is people are assume that, well, because they don't speak English, that somehow rates, you can assume something about their intelligence. It's ridiculous. You don't know anything about them. You have to find out stuff from people. You can have people that are brilliant. Students come to you, they're young, but they can do all kinds of advanced math. They just need the English. And you have to teach them not just written English, but reading and writing and speaking and listening, which means it's not, you're more like the high school, not totally, but you're somewhat like the high school Spanish teacher, only you're dealing with people that have to learn Spanish. This is not high school Spanish where we just go through the motions. You learn a few words and you pass, so you don't have to take it in college. No, they have to learn English because their livelihood depends on it. Their success in the world, the success of their family and their well-being depends on them learning English. So you're an ESL teacher, you matter a lot, okay? Now I'm gonna stop right there with this video because this is just a little bit about background. As I think I mentioned in the previous video introduction, being an ESL teacher is part being an advocate, part being a good teacher with good technique and knowledge of resources, part being a person who can work with families in difficult situations, or like a social worker, only the people you're working with don't have your customs and they have a different approach. They may be religiously very different from you. They may be psychologically have suffered from terrible trauma. There are cases of people have gone through war, assaults, terrible things. I mentioned some of those just a minute ago. So you're dealing with that. And then you have to deal with the people in your own school and say, I need you to be able to help work with these kids. And it's been very popular lately, people to criticize those that come from other countries, to not like the stranger, to hate people that are different from themselves. And that's makes it even more challenging. So you're kind of like a saint, you're kind of like a teacher, you're kind of like a technician, you're kind of like a social worker. You are all these things. And even a regular teacher does a lot of the same stuff. You may find clothing for a family. You may find immigration assistance for a family. Well, you wouldn't do that with them. Somebody's not an immigrant, but you do what the family needs. I've seen cases where kids have medical issues, health issues, special education needs, and they didn't speak English. And it was not simple. It was not just textbook, this is what you do, and the student has problems understanding this math concept. It went way beyond it. So I get really excited when I talk about this because you literally learn on the job to do different things. So that's part of what I want to say right now for this video. And then I'm also going to talk about some terms you need to know in ESL. I actually made this big sheet. And you know, some people might make a PowerPoint, but I didn't make a PowerPoint. But I've got this big sheet for week 1 assignments. And you can read through it. And I'm going to give you some videos like this, keep them short, hopefully, so that I can kind of interpret and make it a little more interesting for you. I may wear a different hat or a different shirt. Okay, you can see I love books. Look at my room. I love plants. I love books. I like Einstein. I've got an Einstein up here. This is called an action figure of Albert Einstein. Kind of a joke, but actually Einstein's, oops, I just dropped Einstein. He's now in, drop him in the trash, got him out. Okay, so I'm going to stop right now and I want to welcome you to the class. The discussion is going to be an introduction of yourselves to the class, but I'm going to try to do a little different. I've had people do culture maps and stuff, and I'll let you know when I'm going to do what I'm going to do for that. But so this is the second video I'm sending out to you. And I'll get this posted as soon as my password works on Canvas. For some reason, I changed my password, got it all straightened out, and tonight, my computer acts like it doesn't know me, or the Canvas does. So thank you very much.